Can the Orange land multiple elite recruits in the near future? Well, here to talk about it is 24/7 Sports insider Mike McAllister.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we are joined by Syracuse 24/7 Sports insider Mike McAllister to talk all things 2026 Syracuse football recruiting. The Orange are going after multiple four-star defensive backs, who we'll talk about later on in the show. But first, we are going to discuss how the Orange are going after a couple of elite wide receiver recruits, one of which is located not too far from Syracuse University. All that and more here on today's show. But before we get to everything, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Mike, thank you so much for taking the time this evening to hop on the Locked On Syracuse podcast. Let's get right to it. Messiah Hampton. You all might be familiar with him. 6'1", 180-pound wide receiver from Rochester, New York. That's right, Rochester, New York. And he is a consensus four-star recruit. This is one of the best wide receivers in the country. In fact, he is one of the best or highest rated recruits to come out of New York in a very long time. And he is scheduled to verbally commit at the time of this podcast 8 days from now on June 13th. So, Mike, open-ended question here. What's the latest with Messiah Hampton's recruitment?
Well, he's going to visit Syracuse this coming weekend. And the original plan was that was going to be his final visit. He was going to go into decision-making mode and sort of take the week to make a decision. That was good news for Syracuse fans because that meant that he was not taking an official to Oregon. When I spoke to him right after he announced his top 7, I think it was, and set the commitment date, that was what he told me. He was going to visit Miami, as he did this past weekend. Then he was going to visit Syracuse, which is this coming weekend. Originally, he had Ohio State scheduled for this coming weekend, but flipped that to Syracuse. And the original plan, before he announced his top 7 and a commitment date, was that he was going to visit Oregon the following weekend after visiting Syracuse. When he set the commitment date, he said, Miami and Syracuse, that's it, then going into decision-making mode. Since then, he has taken that visit to Miami, but Oregon has not just said, oh, well, and let it be. They have continued to recruit him. They are trying to get him to come up the week after his visit to Syracuse, so that week leading up to his commitment date. I believe as of right now, according to our profile page on 24/7 Sports, he is scheduled to visit Oregon starting on June 9th. So that would be, I believe, Monday. So he would be on campus for a few days and then go into decision-making mode off of that. But, he's an elite prospect. Syracuse is certainly very heavily in the mix. I think they're going to do everything that they can on this official visit to make him not want to take that Oregon trip.
And how many schools do you think have a legitimate shot here? You mentioned how there's a top 6 or 7, but how many actually have a chance here?
I think it's the 3 that we mentioned. It's Miami, Syracuse, and Oregon. Those are kind of the 3 that are the most heavily involved. Whenever you have a commitment date and you're only taking a few officials, usually the schools that you're visiting are going to be the ones that are at the forefront of the recruitment. Now, that can be a little bit that's not always the case in every single recruitment. There can be a time where someone has visited a school several times and so said, I don't need to take an official there. I'm going to take my officials elsewhere so that I can evaluate everything. But in this case, the 3 schools, Miami, Syracuse, and Oregon, seem to be the ones that are the most heavily involved. Oregon was kind of the favorite going into the spring. or coming out of the spring, I should say. And then once this commitment date was set and Oregon didn't have a visit, it seemed like Syracuse had some of the buzz. Now I think it's kind of up in the air between the three, but I'd put Syracuse and Oregon a little bit ahead of Miami at this point.
Well, there might be a reason why Miami might be backing off Messiah Hampton here, because we're going to get to another wide receiver right now. Calvin Russell, 6'5", 195-pound wide receiver from Miami, Florida. So that makes perfect sense here. 24/7 Sports, 5-star recruit. He is scheduled to verbally commit on July 5th. Now, I've heard you say this, that Calvin Russell is not officially visiting Syracuse football. How does that impact the recruitment?
Well, that's the interesting thing about this. I had expected that at some point during this month he'd visit Syracuse, kind of, I'd say, within the last few weeks. But recently he told me that he was not visiting and that he wasn't planning to before his decision. Now, on face value, that would seem to be a bad sign for Syracuse. Here's where you can spin it to be a positive thing. And you can spin things and twist things kind of any way you want, right? In any of these things. But he's visited Syracuse multiple times. He visited multiple times for games this past season. He visited for the spring game. And when he visited for the spring game, he did so over schools like Miami and Georgia and Alabama. They all had spring games. They were all much closer than Syracuse. He elected to travel from Florida to Central New York to see Syracuse's spring game. That, to me, was telling that Syracuse was legitimately involved in this recruiting process. So he's been here several times, and he thinks very highly of the coaching staff. Yes, you'd still rather have him take an official now, but if he doesn't take an official now, he can take one in the fall, which means if you win the recruitment now and he doesn't take an official, now you get your 5-star wide receiver on campus this fall, shortly before signing day, to try to have him help you bring in some of those targets towards the end of the recruiting cycle. That's where you could have a positive in him not visiting. The other thing is, if he commits somewhere else, but you continue to recruit him, maybe you can get him on an official visit right before signing day and try to change his mind right then. So there is a positive, if you want, or a silver lining, so to speak, if he doesn't take an official now. That said, I think you'd prefer that he does if you're Syracuse, just because you want to get that last pitch in before he makes his announcement. But Syracuse is heavily involved. I think Miami is very involved. The biggest thing with him is he's kept his visit schedule extremely close to the vest. So I think he's just kind of popping up on campuses this month, and we'll see where he ends up going. But he's been really good at not tipping his hand, and I think it's going to kind of stay that way until we get close to the announcement.
Do you sense a favorite in Calvin Russell's recruitment?
You know, I kind of sense that Syracuse might be the favorite before I found out that he wasn't taking an official. And not to say that that's completely changed my mind, but it's certainly given me a little bit of pause. And I think just because of the way that he has been with his recruiting process and how close he's kept everything, it's very difficult to tell. And I think that's by design. That's the way he wants it. You know, I don't think he wants it being leaked out there that one school is significantly ahead of all these other schools or whatever the case is. But Syracuse has things going for it. You know, the offense is very wide receiver friendly, as we saw last season, with 2 wide receivers and a tight end that put up monster numbers. Even had a running back that put up good numbers from a receiving standpoint. You know, that's a positive, his relationship with the coaches. But then the other part of this is he also would like the opportunity to play basketball at the college level. He does have offers as a basketball player at the Division I level. And I know that there's been conversations between him and Syracuse about playing both, and that Syracuse is open to it. So those are things that Syracuse has in its favor. Now, what the NIL situation looks like, what some of, you know, the other schools are going to offer, how many other schools are open to basketball as well, you know, all that's going to factor in, but they're certainly heavily in the mix. And I think regardless of where he commits in early July, If he does pick Syracuse, obviously that's good for Syracuse. You're going to have to hold off other schools till signing day. And if he commits elsewhere, I don't think that means that Syracuse is going to back off either.
Got it. All right, Mike, we'll continue to talk about Calvin Russell and Messiah Hampton after this. The NBA Finals are here, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments, whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player. There's never been a better time to get in on the action, and FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live with player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays. Fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. And guess what? If you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up because you can head to FanDuel.com right now and place your first $5 bet. That's it, $5. And if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. This is Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and we are joined by Syracuse 24/7 sports insider Mike McAllister. We left off talking about the recruitment of five-star wide receiver out of Miami, Florida, Calvin Russell. So I want to touch on the Ross Douglas element here. So we're talking wide receivers. Syracuse's wide receiver coach was Ross Douglas a year ago. And then earlier this offseason, he moved to Oregon. So, Mike, you kind of alluded to it a little bit with Messiah Hampton, but it also, I think, could impact Calvin Russell. So, overall, how does Ross Douglas, the wide receivers coach of Syracuse a year ago, leaving this offseason, impact Syracuse's chances of landing one of Messiah Hampton or Calvin Russell?
I don't think it's going to impact Russell much, to be honest with you. Mainly because even though Oregon isn't involved there to some extent, I don't think they're as heavily involved as some other schools. Messiah Hampton is really, I think, where he could be a thorn in Syracuse's side, because when he was here, he was recruiting Hampton to Syracuse, and so they developed a relationship, and they have a strong bond, and so that helps Oregon. And we know Oregon is backed by Nike. We know they have about as deep pockets from an NIL standpoint as anyone in the country. And if they really want someone, they're not going to get outbid. Now, are they willing to go crazy and way overpay for someone like Messiah Hampton? I don't know. Would Syracuse pay more for Messiah Hampton because he's an in-state kid and somewhat local, being from Rochester, than they would if he was from West Virginia, Florida, Georgia? I think they'd pay more because he's from New York. So might be willing to overspend a little bit there. How those numbers match up, I don't know how much of a factor that is. He says it's not going to be the number one factor in his recruitment, but the fact that you've got a guy who helped you recruit a player for a year, developed a good relationship with him, and now he's at a school with as deep of NIL pockets as anywhere in the country, that's certainly going to play a factor in this. And I think if Oregon had hired someone else as a wide receivers coach who wasn't Ross Douglas, who had been recruiting Messiah Hampton for a year plus, not to say that Oregon wouldn't still be involved and they wouldn't still be recruiting him. I'm just not sure they would have been able to convince him to come take an official visit as easily as they would when they have someone who has that established relationship with him. So there's no doubt in my mind that factors in for Messiah Hampton. I just don't think that it has the same impact for Calvin Russell as it does for Messiah Hampton.
And of these two wide receivers, who do you think, or who do you know Syracuse is prioritizing more?
I don't know that there's, I don't know what their recruiting board looks like. So this is strictly me guessing. If I had to guess and you had to pick one of the two, I think for perception, getting the number one player in New York, who is also an elite level prospect, might be a little bit more important. that makes it sound like Calvin Russell's not important, and I don't want it to come across that way because I think they both are. And Syracuse does have a chance to get both of them. And imagine a world where Syracuse has a top 20 recruiting class and they get a 5-star wide receiver and a top 100 overall player who is also the number 1 player in New York.
Hold on. Wait a minute. And they got that guy Goff.
And they got Goff. So you'd have 3 4-star plus wide receivers in your recruiting class. And they got a kid from Delaware named BJ Garrett, who is only a 3-star, but he's a high 3-star. I think he's really good. They got another kid from Delaware who his name is escaping me at the moment, but I know they really like him as well. So you'd have just a big-time wide receiver recruiting class. And it would almost guarantee, if you got both of those guys, that Syracuse would finish in the top 25 in the recruiting rankings, assuming they don't have major turnover from the players that they have currently committed. So, I think getting the number 1 player in New York because of location, you might have a slight preference there. But at the same time, landing a 5-star player at Syracuse, that's going to send a message as well. So there's definitely pros on both sides. I just think with the location and trying to lock down New York, that Fran Brown has clearly made a priority, would probably have a slight preference there.
Awesome. And is there anything else you'd like to add on Calvin Russell and Messiah Hampton?
I think if you would have said 2 years ago that Syracuse would be heavily involved with these 2 type of players, maybe Messiah Hampton because of the in-state thing and he's local, but a 5-star wide receiver from Florida who has family ties to Miami and Miami wants, and so does a whole bunch of other programs, is considering coming to Syracuse over those other schools. And again, took a visit for the spring game over Georgia, Alabama, Miami, etc. I mean, that tells you all you need to know about Fran Brown and the impact he's had.
Fair enough. Let's move on to defensive backs, which is actually Fran Brown's background, because in case you all don't know, or in case you all forgot, Fran Brown, before being at Syracuse, was the defensive backs coach over at Georgia, and Syracuse is pursuing a couple of elite defensive backs in the 2026 recruiting cycle. Let's start off with CJ Hester, 6'1", 185-pound defensive back from Miami, Florida, a 4-star recruit. Now, from just surfing the internet, okay, so no sources here, but just reading the tea leaves online.
Google's, right? Yeah.
Google's a thing, right?
Yeah.
It seems like Florida has a lot of buzz for him. Seems like they're the favorite, right? So how is Syracuse's outlook in the race for CJ Hester? Or is this just a done deal? He's going to Florida.
I don't think there's any such thing as a done deal in recruiting. There's been players that everyone thought was going to one school and ends up going somewhere else. Quante Gillians, I'll use as an example. Rochester kid, last recruiting cycle, 2025, signed with Syracuse, defensive lineman, committed to Syracuse. After he commits to Syracuse, Michigan gets involved. They start recruiting him. They offer him. They get him on campus for an official visit. And in years past, the thought would have been, Michigan wants a kid. I don't care if he's committed to Syracuse. He's going to Michigan. And yet was never really a concern. And he signs with Syracuse and all is well. Now, of course, that's an in-state kid. That's a little bit different. But the point is, at the time, Michigan was defending national champs. Still a ton of buzz around that program. One of the best of all time. Blue blood, all of that. Syracuse holds him off. So is Florida considered the favorite right now? I'd say yes. But not a favorite enough that they have crystal ball predictions coming out of, everywhere across the country. So that to me tells me there's at least some openness there. And the good news is he's already visited Florida. And he's still coming to visit Syracuse. He's got other visits scheduled after that, UCLA and Iowa, I believe, are the next 2. But I think if it was a done deal that he's definitely going to Florida and there's no wiggle room there whatsoever, you take the visit to Florida, you commit, you end your recruitment at that point. But he didn't. So now he's coming to Syracuse. Does Syracuse have work to do, ground to make up? Sure, that's all, logical. But with Fran Brown, I don't think anything is impossible. As you mentioned, his background is defensive backs, and getting him on campus and being able to talk to him as like, hey, I've sent a lot of defensive backs to the NFL at a bunch of different schools: Temple, Rutgers, Baylor, Georgia, and now even Syracuse. So come here, learn under me. We took a kid from Florida last year who was a highly rated defensive back who was once committed to Florida, then flipped over to us. And now he's talked about as potentially the next Travis Hunter. Come follow that lineage. I think there's a pitch there, and there's things that Syracuse can talk to him about that will make Syracuse a viable option. The other thing is, what if he wants to play corner and other schools are recruiting him at safety? And Fran Brown says, I'll make you a corner. I'll make you an NFL corner. I mean, those are the types of things that can happen behind the scenes in some of these discussions that can really sway a kid one way or another. But Syracuse is very much involved. I don't think it's a done deal and they have no chance, but I wouldn't say you would consider them necessarily the favorite at this juncture of the recruiting process either.
Okay, so one more question here about CJ Hester. Obviously, we know Florida is involved, Syracuse is involved. Who else is involved here, and who do you actually think has a chance for CJ Hester?
Anytime someone visits a school, I think that school at least has a puncher's chance. So he has scheduled visits to UCLA and Iowa the 2 weekends after his visit to Syracuse. Now, could that change and he could visit a different school instead? Of course, those types of things happen all the time. So those, as of right now, I would say are also involved. He previously took an official visit to Auburn. So I would say, they're involved to some extent as well. But I do think from a Syracuse perspective, you're certainly viewing Florida as your main competition here.
Awesome. We are joined by Mike McAllister, Syracuse 24/7 Sports Insider. We left off talking about CJ Hester, a 4-star recruit out of Florida. And guess what? We're going to talk about another 4-star recruit out of Florida right now, Tedarius Hughes. He's very interesting. 6'2", 170-pound defensive back. That's really not the interesting part. He's from Florida. Again, from Florida. Now, what else is new? 4-star recruit. I mean, I guess that's exciting, right? Mm-hmm. The interesting part is that he's currently a Florida State verbal commit. I do notice that he has a scheduled visit with Syracuse. Am I correct on that?
Well, he did.
He did.
I actually got word from him today that he's not visiting this weekend.
Oh.
Now, I did ask him if that means he's going to visit a different weekend this month, and I didn't get an answer. So that could mean yes, but he's keeping it quiet. That could mean no, and I'm done talking to the Syracuse guy. I mean, who knows? But the interesting thing about him is, yes, he's committed to Florida State and has been. Yes, he's from Florida. He goes to the same high school as Calvin Russell. But also, he posted a picture on social media within the last week and a half, 2 weeks, I forget the exact date, just randomly out of nowhere in, I believe, his house, decked out in Syracuse gear, winter hat, t-shirt, all of that stuff. It was completely random. And so when I saw that, he was always on my list of, I know he's got a scheduled official visit, but is he actually going to end up taking it, or is Florida State going to say, don't take that visit? And he'll say, okay, fine. So when I saw that, I went, all right, he's definitely at least going to come up and give Syracuse a look. But so when he told me that he wasn't coming, that was a little bit of a surprise. Now, that could also mean that he actually still is coming, but wants to keep it quiet, wants to keep it private. That's also a possibility. Or Syracuse could have said, yeah, we could get him on campus now, but then he's so close to Florida State, he's going to go to several games. Even if we flip him right now, he's probably going to end up going to several games next year. So what if we just wait and we try to get him on campus for an official visit before signing day? That's another possibility. I don't know any of those scenarios, what the exact situation is. He could also have just decided I'm locked in with Florida State and As much as I think highly of Fran Brown, the Syracuse program, I'm locked in, I'm staying close to home, etc. The rumblings with him were that staying close to home was probably the favorite on what he was going to do. But wouldn't surprise me if Syracuse stayed involved with him, at least up until signing day.
Well, that's news that he's not visiting this upcoming weekend. Is he visiting anywhere else, or is he
not that I'm aware of? So our Florida State site does kind of a cool little feature, which is Florida State commits or recruiting targets that are visiting other schools. And they put out a list of commits and targets that are visiting elsewhere this coming weekend. And he was not listed on that, which is what first kind of alerted me to, oh, I thought he was supposed to be coming up here. Because on that list was another player. His name is Karan Maycock from Miami Central. He is also a Florida State commit. He is visiting Syracuse this weekend. And so he was on that list. I said, well, he wasn't someone I was expecting to be on campus this weekend. And I don't see Tedarius Hughes there because Syracuse also has an offensive lineman from Florida named Xavier Payne, who's also committed to Florida State, visiting this weekend. He's originally from upstate New York, so there's ties there. But regardless, I didn't see Tedarius Hughes on that list, and they're very plugged in, so that leads me to believe he's not visiting anywhere else this weekend.
Okay. Well, in other news, Syracuse did have a decommitment the other day, a 3-star defensive back.
Yeah.
Keywords there, defensive back. It's very interesting. Zaiden McDonald. He decommitted and decided he's going to Stanford. All right, cool. Now that he decommitted, is there a reason why he decommitted? Like, does that in any way affect the pursuit of either one of these defensive backs that we mentioned, Tedarius Hughes or CJ Hester?
I don't think it impacts the guys that they were targeting, Tedarius Hughes, CJ Hester, other defensive backs that they've been after. They're going to have a bunch of talented players. Zakir Leaks is a player from Pennsylvania. They've been recruiting. They're recruiting him as an athlete. I think he's going to end up at defensive back, but and they're going to have more defensive backs on campus, likely the weekend of the 13th. So I don't think it has anything to do with, they're going after more players at my position. Let me look elsewhere. I'll give you, I texted with Zaiden McDonald after he decommitted and asked him what his biggest reason was. So I'll read you what he says, and then I'll kind of give you my thoughts on it. He says, the biggest reason I flipped is because of the guaranteed success after college. My career will come to an end one day, so I wanted a second option of success, and I personally feel like it's very obtainable at Stanford. So clearly that to me says he thought very highly of the academics at Stanford, and that was a huge reason why he decided to flip. It's honestly hard to argue with that, right? I mean, Stanford is one of the elite academic institutions in the country, and the fact that you have the ability to play Power 4 football at a school that has a pretty good football tradition as well. Sometimes there's a school that just has things like that you just say, okay, I get it. And I really think that that's really all that it was. Thinks very highly of Syracuse, thinks very highly of the coaching staff, but very academic and education focused, and got the opportunity at Stanford, went to visit them this past weekend. It was everything that he thought it was, and decided to flip his commitment. I don't think it's anything really deeper than that, to be honest with you.
Okay. Well, Mike, thank you so much for joining here. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just, they've had one big official visit weekend. I know there weren't a bunch of commitments. And usually when you have an official visit weekend and there aren't commitments, everyone says, well, what's going on? But this weekend and next weekend, I think, is really where we could start seeing some things. But the other thing to keep in mind is when you're recruiting the level of players that Syracuse is recruiting, oftentimes they're going to be taking other visits, even after they commit. Amari Goff, who we mentioned earlier, 4-star receiver who's committed, is still taking the rest of his visits this month. Javion Cooper, who's an offensive lineman from Florida, who's supposed to be visiting not this coming weekend, but the next weekend, is visiting other schools this month. Jarius Rogers, same thing, 4-star defensive lineman from Florida. Cameron Wilson, another defensive lineman from Florida. They're both visiting other schools. When you're recruiting the caliber of players that Syracuse is recruiting, oftentimes they go through the entire visit schedule, and even if they commit, they still take visits elsewhere. So it's just something I think Syracuse fans have to get used to when you up the level of not only who you're recruiting, but the competition you're recruiting against.
Awesome. And Mike, where can people find you on social media?
You can find me on Twitter at McAllister Mike1. You can find me on Blue Sky, the same name. I'm also on Threads, although not as active there. And then I have an Instagram account, which is Mike_McAllister. And of course, the website has a Twitter account at Syracuse on 247. Same thing on Instagram. And then same thing on Facebook as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. And for your second listen and you want more football recruiting updates, you can check out the new Locked On Portal show with football recruiting expert Brian Smith, who's got the latest rumors and signings each and every day. You can be the most informed fan on the rapid changes to the college football landscape. Find the Portal podcast on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Folks, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for listening. If you like this podcast, be sure to hit that like button. If you really enjoy the podcast, be sure to hit subscribe. Tell all your friends about Locked On Syracuse, and I will see you all again soon.